Good evening. I'm Mary Pat Higgins, President and CEO of the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. Thank you all so much for joining us for the second session of this year's Crucial Conversation series on challenging AAPI hatred. I'd like to start by thanking our generous sponsors for this series, our presenting sponsor, Texas Instruments and Texas Instruments Foundation. Thank you for your leadership in the community and helping make this series possible. And our series sponsors, IMA Financial Services and IMA Foundation, Bank of Texas, and Mavs Take Action. We are so grateful for your support of the museum for this important series. I'd also like to extend our thanks to our community partners for tonight's events. AJC Dallas, Dallas Dinner Table, Dallas Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation, Jewish Federation of Greater Dallas's Jewish Community Relations Council, League of Women Voters of Dallas, Legacy Senior Communities, Mosaic Family Services, Refugee Services of Texas, Southwest Jewish Congress, and Temple Shalom. Thank you all so much for your support and partnership. I'd also like to give a warm welcome to our museum members, board members, and volunteers watching tonight. We couldn't put on programs like this without you. And if you're watching and interested in becoming a member or volunteer, please check out our website, dhhrm.org, to learn more. We'd love to welcome you to our family. The goal of the Crucial Conversation series is to create a space to discuss pervasive institutional issues in our country and beyond. Given what we've seen over the last 3 weeks, the murder of 19 children and 2 teachers in their classrooms, the racially motivated shootings at a grocery store in Buffalo and at a salon right here in Dallas, it feels more important than ever to reflect on these issues and ask, how can we do better? In this year's Crucial Conversation series, we aim to foster an increased understanding of the origins and history of discrimination against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the U.S., to discuss the recent increase in anti-AAPI violence and rhetoric, and to identify concrete steps that can be taken to confront and disrupt AAPI hatred. In our first session, we began learning about the history of AAPI communities in the U.S., and we will continue that discussion tonight. We'll leave time for questions at the end of tonight's discussion. And I ask that you try to focus your questions on the topics we're covering tonight and save questions related to future sessions for those programs. Because we have so much to talk about, this program may run a little longer than usual, but we'll be recording the program, so you can always come back to it on the DHHRM YouTube channel if you need to step away at any point. I'm now pleased to have such an esteemed panel with us tonight, and I'd love to leave as much time as possible for their discussion, so I'm just going to introduce them briefly. Shelley Lee is currently a professor of history and chair of comparative American studies at Oberlin College. This fall, she will join the faculty at Brown University as a professor of American studies. Her scholarship and teaching focus on Asian American history, and her publications include the book Koreatown, Los Angeles: Immigration, Race, and the American Dream. She has been a consultant with K-12 educators on Asian American history and was involved in the creation of the museum's current special exhibition, Courage and Compassion: Our Shared Story of the Japanese American World War II Experience. Chia Yuyi Vang is Vice Chancellor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Her teaching and research interests include 20th century U.S. international history, the Cold War in Asia, Asian American history, Hmong history, refugee migration, and transnational and diasporic communities. She is author of 4 books, including Hmong America, Reconstructing Community and Diaspora, and is currently writing a new book entitled The Sorrow of Displacement: Southeast Asian Identity and Belonging in the Global South. Our moderator tonight is Sylvia Kamatsu, Chief Content and Diversity Officer for KERA, a not-for-profit public media organization in North Texas that reaches 2.6 million people each week. Sylvia is responsible for content on all of KERA's digital, radio, and television platforms. She also oversees diversity and inclusion efforts across the organization. Prior to her current role, Sylvia was a reporter, documentary producer and writer, and executive producer on many award-winning programs. I'd now like to turn things over to our wonderful panel.
Well, thank you so much for that very warm introduction, Mary Pat, and deepest thanks to you and everyone at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum for creating this space for the conversation tonight. And Chi and Shelley, it's great to be with you this evening. Before we dive into the history, I'd love for you both to share just briefly how your own identities have helped shape your work.
Sure. I can speak a little first, but I wanted to first just thank Annie, Caroline, Mary Pat, and Sylvia in the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all this evening. So for me, I would say becoming a US historian and deciding to study Asian Americans and race relations were related but different processes. I was born in Seoul, South Korea, and came to the US with my family in the late 70s as part of the dramatic upsurge of new immigration after 1965, which we'll talk about tonight. My family and I settled in the California Bay Area, south of San Francisco, a very diverse, multi-ethnic, multiracial area that was, profoundly transformed by immigration. And so in school, growing up in the California Bay Area, history was my favorite subject early on. Learning about the past through stories was very enthralling to me as a young child. But at the same time, as a kid growing up in the US in the kind of 70s, 80s, and 90s, I developed a really acute awareness of, the sense that I was kind of marginal and a sense of outsiderness due to, factors that seem to have something to do with my race and background. So then in college, I continued to be enthralled by history, especially US history, and became, pretty serious about pursuing academia because I was drawn to the idea of being, not just continuing to study history, but becoming a researcher who got to participate in uncovering and telling the stories about the American past. And as far as which stories I wanted to participate in telling, I became drawn to this subject I learned about in college called ethnic studies. And this is a field dating to the late 1960s that examines experiences of racial minorities in the US and really critically engages dominant intellectual frameworks and our assumptions about American society and the American past. So I knew that I wanted to engage US history and to contribute to a larger conversation about the nation and its past by studying the history of race, racism, and Asian Americans. So over the years, as I've worked on different projects, this kind of, that guiding ethos to expand and really complicate how we think of the American past by bringing stories of marginalized people to light has informed all of my work, leading right up to the forthcoming book about Koreatown in Los Angeles, and some of the advising that I now do on K through 12 education, and really trying to incorporate Asian Americans in US history. So that was a lot, but that's a bit of my background and how it informs my work.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Shelley. And Chia, we'd love to hear your story.
Sure. I'm also very, honored to be in this space with all of you. Thank you to all the organizers. Shelley has named all of you, so I won't do that. I'll just say ditto to what Shelley said. I'm also really pleased to be in this space with you, Sylvia and Shelley. Shelley and I share a a story of immigration, but I think our stories are very divergent, right? Because my family came to the US in 1980 and I was about 9 years old. I was born in Laos. And so we were refugees from the Vietnam War or the American War, however one wants to call it. And for me, it was very interesting because I grew up in the Twin Cities, in the heart of, snow and a very different environment, not very diverse. We brought the diversity, the refugee, population to the Twin Cities. So what it is today is really a reflection of the ways in which my community have actually contributed to that space. So I want to say this is a wonderful question because I think about it a lot. When I was younger, much younger in school, when we grew up in the United States, our K-12 education is so Eurocentric that as a child, you begin to think that was what was most important to study, that was worthwhile to study. So I was interested in, American political thought, European political history. I studied abroad in France. That was what I was drawn to. So all of that is so wonderful as well. But as I went to graduate school, as I thought about exactly kind of what Shelley said too, is that whose stories are not there. And when I'm in the archives, I love history too. Civics was my favorite subject once I learned how to read and write. But when I'm in the archive, I'm always asking whose voices are not here, right? The people that I'm really interested in studying, refugees, for example. I became very interested in graduate school, not to just write what other people have written about, add to that, but it's how do I contribute? So what motivated me, what fuels my research, what is sort of the driving force between my work in academia is that I want to also be telling stories. I want to also be, writing about my community's history because it has always been written by other people. And so that's my driving force. That's what gives me joy in doing this work. And, as soon as I write 4 Hmong books about Hmong and refugee, it almost seems like, aren't you going to write anything else? But if you really look at my work, I would argue is that it is US history, it is global history through the lens of a group of people who became entangled in these larger political military forces that are now actually changing different spaces in places that they are never expected to be. So my identity growing up, it was very important, huge emphasis about Hmongness. So I never had to question about who I was. My place, not being a model, minority, was a very peculiar place to be as well. So that's kind of my background. That's what, identity is very important because we do things that we care about. It has to have meaning, and this is what has meaning for me.
Well, thanks to you both for the work you're doing, which is doing exactly that, helping to elevate the many diverse voices in our community. In the first session in this discussion series, the focus was on the 19th century. The second half, which saw increasingly intense hostility against Asian immigrants, as well as several laws enacted to restrict immigration. Chi, as we're moving into the early part of the 20th century, what do you see happening and what are Asian American Pacific Islander communities facing at that time? Oh, and you're on mute.
Thank you so much. The late 1900s were such a precarious time for people of Asian descent. And as we all have learned, or if you didn't watch the last session, at least you may have heard of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, just a summary, right? So that was particularly focused on, Chinese, but as you know, once it's, renewed, it kept expanding. So when we began, as we entered the 20th century, that's exactly what happened. It expanded restrictions, exclusionary legislations, policies to a broader group of Asians. So beginning with just Chinese, but as we enter, as fewer and fewer Chinese could enter the United States, then other Asian groups were recruited to come in larger numbers. And then as the numbers increased, then they became part of the problem, right? We've heard about Asians sort of viewed as people who could not assimilate into the society, always thought of as the Orient, as not kind of backwards, and as they migrate to the West, they're supposed to transition to a modern sort of identity, but always thought of as the other, not being able to transition. So more and more Asians became part of the exclusionary practices of that is state sanctioned. I want to say that as in terms of immigration, we think about what the experiences were for AAPI at that time. There was so much, right? Labor, for example, education, housing, segregation. People often think that, we as Asian Americans, we don't want to integrate. That's why we live in enclaves. That's why we only live in Chinatown or Koreatown or certain, areas. But there are big reasons why we are not living in many other spaces, because people couldn't at the time. They couldn't go to school. So segregation was so explicit for people of Asian descent at that time as well. So I'll stop there, and maybe Shelley, feel free to chime in, but it is solidifying the exclusion of people of Asian descent.
Yeah, Shelley, please share your thoughts, because as we know, we sometimes lump everybody all together, but of course, different groups have different experiences. So yes, we'd love for you to expand on what those experiences were at that time, given the immigration laws.
Yeah, I mean, moving into towards the turn of the 20th century, and then even into the 20th century, if I can say more into that. I think just to pick up on what Chia said, as well as the speakers from part one. I mean, we see from the late 19th century onward, really kind of the beginnings and the formalization and the expansion of what historian Erica Lee has called, kind of the gatekeeping functions of US immigration. And it's not that there were open borders before Chinese exclusion, but the function, the kind of overall purpose of immigration wasn't to kind of identify and keep out certain groups of people, but anyways, the kind of expansion of U.S. immigration and naturalization policy towards gatekeeping, like really expands and solidifies coming up to the turn of the 20th century. I mean, if I can continue into the 20th century, I think, kind of turn of the 20th century to around mid 20th century is a really fascinating and complicated period for US immigration and naturalization policy, because in short, we go from the policy being very restrictive and, like I said, having mainly a gatekeeping function, especially towards Asians, but then into, towards kind of, the mid 20th century, things gradually start to open up. Like we sort of see the chipping away at this regime of Asian exclusion and the, kind of gradual dismantling of the US as a gatekeeping state. So these are decades in which we witness something of a sea change with regard to the treatment of Asians. But again, it's gradual. So I can walk through a little bit of it. And Chia and I said at the beginning that we weren't going to be too lectury, but apologies in advance because I do want to dig in a bit. Yeah, I mean, I would say like certainly like into the first couple of decades of the 20th century, the kind of restrictiveness of US immigration and naturalization policy, really just expands. And so 1924 is considered the culmination of US nativism and xenophobia in a lot of ways. There's a passage of this law called the Johnson-Reed Act, which creates an immigration system that is based on national origins quotas. what does that mean? So it creates these national origins quotas that favors people from Western and Northern European nations. It's very racially based. It actually disadvantages people from Southern and Eastern European nations. So it's kind of a moment of general xenophobia and nativism. It's not just targeted at Asians, but it also makes inadmissible for immigration people belonging to this category called aliens ineligible to citizenship. And that's, you know, a kind of vague and nebulous category, but at the time in 1924, it was not vague and nebulous insofar as it applied, you know, pretty categorically to Asians. So the 1924 Immigration Johnson-Reed Act is, you know, really considered kind of this sweeping Asian Exclusion Act on top of, you know, being this generally restrictive nativist policy. And, you know, the kind of early to mid 20th centuries, or in 20th century, moving up to the 1940s is really kind of a low point for US immigration, in part because of these restrictive policies, but, you know, but also because of, like, you know, the Great Depression and the start of World War II, like immigration just hits a real low point. But the regime of exclusion towards Asians and immigration in general starts to get chipped away at starting in World War II. And that begins with the passage of the Magnuson Act in 1943. And that basically dismantles Chinese exclusion. So these series of laws that she had talked about, you know, beginning with the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. You know, and at the time, you know, 1943, the nation and the world were changing as far as, you know, it was becoming, you know, kind of less acceptable to be overtly racist in immigration policy, to, you know, kind of champion explicitly racist policy. Plus, during World War II, the United States and China were allies, right? So politically and socially, it made kind of more sense for the US to move in this direction, to start revising and rethinking its exclusionary nativist immigration system. But that act, the Magnuson Act, which dismantles Chinese exclusion, was just the first step in a gradual dismantling that occurs over really the rest of the 1940s, into the 50s, into the mid 1960s. And then in 1965, we get a comprehensive overhaul of the immigration system that, you know, it doesn't quite open the gates, but it sort of, you know, really kind of changes the dynamics of migration. So that was kind of a walk through a lot of immigration policy.
Shelley, I was just going to add that, you know, I really like how you framed the 1924 Act, right? That was, as I said, it solidified, right? It drew a map about, you know, who could not come to this country. And, you know, if you haven't heard about the Asiatic barred zone, that's exactly what that, you know, 24 Act did. Was like, you know, if you look at the map, it's really, you know, broad. And because Asia as a geographic, you know, space is so expansive, but that's a huge part of the world that, you know, are not eligible to immigrate. So again, starting with just Chinese, but then, you know, expanding it to all of, you know, Asia in so many ways. We think about the push and pull in the ways in which, depending on the political environment of each decade, each, you know, period, you know, certain policies are easily passed, right? And then others are dismantled. And so there's so many factors beyond, I think, just the, you know, Congress. It's what else is happening out in the world that influences, you know, what can easily pass in this country to see who can belong here.
Well, thank you for that broader and deeper context. You know, we also discussed how we wanted to talk specifically about Hawaii, which became a U.S. territory in 1898. And of course, Native Hawaiians had lived on the land for over 1,000 years before seeing an influx of immigrants from Asian countries like Japan, China, and the Philippines, as well as Europeans and Americans who were trying to carve out their own spheres of influence. Chia, what were relations like between Native Hawaiians and these newer immigrants? And what what happened? How did the Hawaiian landscape change?
Yeah, I think it's important to what Shelley and I just talked about, right? That what happened on the, continental US. It's also a reflection of what is happening in, the islands. And for those of us who study this a lot, a number of scholars have talked about this movement, right, as sort of manifest destiny across the Pacific and beyond. And we're all very familiar with westward expansion on the continental US, but people aren't as familiar about the other, beyond the Pacific. So again, trying not to be too lectury, but I think that, as the US expanded, as fewer, Chinese, this is kind of post-emancipation too, right? As the fewer Chinese are available to work in plantations, then you have the plantations in Hawaii, they began to recruit a variety of Asians, right? It was Chinese and the Japanese, Okinawans, Filipinos, Koreans in fewer numbers, but there were many, and then other Europeans that were recruited to work in the plantations too. And I think like all sort of colonized environments, right, you have many different, groups who are invited to be in those space, but Native Hawaiians, in some ways, then these new workers were displacing, Native Hawaiians. And I was reading, and there's Portuguese and Puerto Ricans and Germans and smaller numbers of others who immigrated to work on the islands as well. But I was reading this 1902 survey of 55 plantations. Again, trying not to be too lectury here, but of 55 plantations on the island. And the way in which race, right, and the stratification of race and hierarchy on the plantations, it really privileged whiteness as well, right? The white plantation owners would hire different groups of Asians to come to the island, but the way in which they're valued, who's in managerial, supervisory positions, were very much reserved for, whites. And then Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, Puerto Ricans, Koreans were mainly laborers. So this 1902 survey of 55 plantations looked at the number of people, right? Chinese and Japanese, 85% were laborers. And only about 15% of Chinese and Japanese were, superintendents. So think about that. And Portuguese, they were 6.3% of the workforce, but they were 24% of the superintendents. And the other Caucasians, that's the category, they represent 1.4% of the workforce, but they are 44% of superintendents. So you can see that so many of these individuals who came to work on the island as contract laborers, again, displacing some of the Native Hawaiians, but then also many, once they finished their contract, they didn't go back home. So they stayed. So Chinese and Portuguese and others actually started businesses, banks, and other businesses that they were able to thrive. So who we see on the island today is a reflection of, how it emerged from, that moment in history where the plantation sugar it was thriving. In order for the plantation workers to be able to remain under control, right? Then they needed to have a variety of workers who were actually kept in separate spaces, right? They were not encouraged to work together to fight for equal pay. The pay, I won't go into all the boring numbers, but you can already tell who gets paid the highest per day, right? So the Asian workers were always at the lowest, even though they were laborers, they worked really hard. So the pay was very different. And Native Hawaiians were almost always thought of as even not as, characterized as not as good of workers as these immigrants that were being brought, or contract laborers that were brought. So the relationships were often at times contentious. So it became a way for them not to thrive, and then for them to also resent the newcomers into the space. So those are some of what was transpiring at that very interesting moment that restricted policies for Asians, but then now they're being recruited over to the islands to carry out the labor.
Yeah.
I mean, if I can just add a little bit to that, I think, the history of Asian migration in Hawaii departs so much from, histories to the continental mainland. And, those histories of kind of these successive migrations by, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, and Korean laborers to the islands were in part, by design by these white planters that wanted to control their labor as much as possible. So, in some ways, the distinctiveness of, kind of ethnic identities, right, between, these various groups, not just Asian groups, but like Chia was saying, Portuguese and then Native Hawaiian populations, was in part by design, because if you can keep groups separate, they're easier to control. And if people are able to, kind of cross ethnic and racial boundaries, especially as part of the laboring population, and this occurred in Hawaii too, where there were like kind of inter-ethnic, labor, movements and organizations that challenged the power of planters and managers, then, your laboring population becomes like harder to control and less ruly, and then power is just harder to maintain in the islands. And so there are these kind of deep histories of controlling, these diverse, groups in Hawaii, but also histories of groups, kind of coming together for purposes of organizing for, better working conditions and power, but then also histories of, kind of social intimacy and race mixing in the islands, which involved, Asians and Native Hawaiians as well. So.
And Shelley, I was also thinking about, just the way in which, the relationships in Asia work too, right? So if you put Koreans at that time, right, working next to Japanese, obviously they're not, because of the relationship, they're not going to work together to, I mean, I'm sure many people did, right? Individuals, collaborated, but the divide and conquer strategy has always kept those, who really needed to collaborate apart.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Well, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in 1941, Japanese Americans were deemed a threat to American security. Approximately 120,000 people, the majority of whom were American citizens, were incarcerated in camps across the West. Shelley, what was the impact, both short-term and long-term, of the internment on Japanese Americans? And we were just talking about the difference between Japanese Americans on the mainland and Hawaii, for example.
Right. So the attack on Pearl Harbor occurred in Hawaii, but Japanese in Hawaii were not interned in mass the way Japanese on the West Coast were. So, yeah. So those are huge questions that you're asking, Sylvia, and the short-term impact, I mean, really across the U.S., including Hawaii, was fear and trepidation. On the other hand, the United States had been preparing for the possibility of war with Japan prior to Pearl Harbor, right, throughout the 1930s, as Japanese aggression in parts of Asia was continuing. But among ordinary people in the U.S., the reactions really ran the gamut. So on the one hand, there were kind of scattered incidents, again, across the country, not just on the West Coast, of these scattered incidents of Japanese Americans and Asians mistaken for being Japanese, being violently attacked. There are a number of documented instances of this. And on the other hand, there were stories of compassion and support and calls for calm, including those illustrated in the Courage and Compassion exhibit that's currently at the museum. But about 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, we know this story. President FDR signs Executive Order 9066, which effectively cleared the way for mass removal of Japanese from the West Coast. So there's a lot to say as far as, short term and long term and the medium term. But as far as the internment experience itself, which your exhibit goes into, the Courage and Compassion exhibit goes into quite a bit. It was, disruptive and traumatic for Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans also, endured and carried on. Family life in the camps was upended very dramatically. I mean, just things from like these very mundane things like families not being able to eat meals together in their homes because they're eating in these large mess halls. Traditional sources of community authority were supplanted by, government officials. The fact that people are kind of living in these camps surrounded by barbed wire run by the government. And while, some semblance of normalcy in day-to-day life was achieved in terms of, there were schools and, newspapers in the camps and, jobs in the camps, I think people's kind of just the whole sense of like, what's going to happen, like what does the future hold? When are they going to get out of the camps? Where would they go? When's this war going to end? I mean, all of that was very uncertain. And I guess there's a lot more to say about that. I can even like jump ahead to like the very, very long term and, the redress movement and some of the activism for justice for former internees. But, decades after the last internment camps closed, this kind of redress movement really picked up in the 1970s, led by organizations like the Seattle Evacuation Redress Committee and National Coalition for Redress and Reparations. And it eventually culminated in the Civil Liberties Act of 1988. So it was, a form of justice long deferred. The act was actually signed by President Ronald Reagan. And that law acknowledged that internment was the result of racism, wartime hysteria, and a failure of leadership, and set aside payments for surviving internees. And about half of them, by the time the payments were made, had passed away. So that's kind of a bittersweet long-term legacy of the internment experience. But to bring it even further, or to bring it to the present day, communities, historians, and museums like this one, continue to be engaged in the work of preserving the history of internment and drawing new lessons, as our challenges as a nation and world evolve, and to, just continue to remind ourselves that we really haven't solved the problems of bigotry and intolerance, and to, kind of turn to this history of internment to see, what are the lessons that we really, shouldn't be forgetting, but then continue to, to learn. So.
Sylvia,
go ahead, Chia.
No, Sylvia, part of your question also asked about how did it impact other AAPI communities? And I was thinking that, as I reflect about, the time, it is also about our physical characteristic, right? So when Shelley and I are walking down the street, they don't know what our ethnic background is. And so I remember, I teach sadly, the war a lot in my class. And so I think about, the impact on Chinese Americans and the button that many were wearing, I am Chinese, right? Just a way to, why did they have to do that, right? But it's because when you're walking down, people don't know. So like other things that we'll talk about, the way in which we're all lumped together, and perhaps I think we say AAPI, right? But it probably impacted the AAPI, the Pacific Islander community slightly different, because just the ways in which we physically look, or maybe the South Asian community, precisely impacting the more East Asian, right? Because you physically can't tell. So that's one thing I wanted to bring up, that there'll be other wars, right, in Asia that have impacted Asian Americans in ways that precisely because of our physical characteristic, and you are targeted, you're assumed to be guilty in all kinds of ways that, in fact, you have nothing to do with it.
Yeah, no, that I'm glad you jumped in and addressed that part of the question, Chia. I think this phenomenon of disidentification by non-Japanese American Asian Americans was a fairly common one in the 1940s, and I think that's one of the lessons that I think, or I hope Asian Americans are able to reflect on today, is that, like, kind of fearful, bigoted Americans are not going to care, whether or not you're Japanese or Korean, in the aftermath of the attack on Pearl Harbor. But there was this phenomenon of, Chinese and other non-Japanese Asian Americans wearing buttons to say, like, I am Chinese, I am Korean, or putting up signs in front of their businesses. And I think that was also just shaped by an atmosphere of fear and this kind of belief that, like, if they can just kind of distance themselves from the enemy, then they'll be okay. But yeah, I think for other Asian Americans, it was complicated. There wasn't one reaction, but like other Americans, I think Asian Americans wanted to help defeat the Axis powers too, and like show their loyalty to the U.S. And some, many Chinese Americans, Filipino Americans, and Korean Americans saw, supporting the war effort and even joining the U.S. military as a way to overcome, the historical patterns of exclusion and discrimination and suspicion that they had endured. And I think the ways that they responded to the attack on Pearl Harbor and then internment was also animated by some of the international politics of the war. So you have, lots of Korean Americans who are really eager to see, Korea liberated from Japan, and, and Chinese Americans and Filipino Americans likewise kind of invested in some of the, the geopolitical dimensions, and thus really kind of supporting the war, supporting the U.S., but also being very much against Japan. So it was quite, complicated in that regard.
Well, let's turn to some of the other conflicts that followed World War II. Chia, what impact did American involvement in the Korean and Vietnam wars have on AAPI communities in the U.S.?
Yeah, so that's a great question. Continue the conversation. I think just reminding us that, in the post-World War II, condition where in so many ways, immigration policies were very much influenced by which were you, with the West or the East, and were you with communism or with, the US and Western powers. So that really depending on, that alignment, sometimes enable some groups to come to the US in ways that they wouldn't have been able to if they have aligned with the others. So I think in terms of just the impact on AAPI communities, Korea, we often think of it as the forgotten war, and we talk about that a lot because we focus on World War II, and then we focus a lot on the Vietnam era. But Korea was really foundational in ways in which the US really, solidify its imperial project in a much more overt way than ever before in Asia. And so I'm thinking about, in terms of immigration, even there were war brides during the US occupation of Japan too, but I think the Korean War, the aftermath, you have many war brides who came to the US, and the beginning of the huge transnational adoption of Koreans to come to this country. The Vietnam era, boy, there's so much to talk about that. The massive displacement of, over 2 million people from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and about 1.4 million resettling in the United States. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But after 1975, you have that huge wave of people leaving because they were voting with their feet, right? They were voting with their feet, they were escaping communism, and so they could come to this country. But what's really interesting for me to think about as I reflect is that the 1975 Indochina Migration and Refugee Assistance Act, in fact, the way in which it was not about US laws, what the US contributed to this, chaos, right? But it was more now about these people are escaping communism. We are now saving them by supporting them. So again, immigration policy with countries, communist countries, people leaving, it became so much easier for people to immigrate because of the Cold War. I also think a ramification of the Vietnam War is that, in 1987, you have the American Homecoming Act, right? Allowing, women and children whose fathers were U.S. servicemen in particular to come to the U.S. And that in itself slightly different from the war brides from World War II, Japanese occupation and Korean War. But nevertheless, children of US servicemen could come to this country. So again, very complicated, so sad that we can kind of understand who might be allowed to come depending on US intervention in different parts of the world.
If you could share some more about how the refugees were treated, because of course this country has historically not welcomed refugees, but as you said, we have different circumstances regarding these wars.
Yeah, sure. I'll start, and then Shelley, please jump in too, because this is something I think we both care very much about. As I mentioned, like 1.4 million Southeast Asian or Indo-Chinese refugees, really, people from Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia that came as a result of the Vietnam War. And what's interesting is that in 1975, you have over 100,000 Vietnamese who were airlifted, that famous Saigon evacuation that most people, if they remember, that's what they remember. And those evacuees were brought, to Guam and directly to the United States. But there was a small evacuation of, Hmong people who were recruited by the CIA. And so there was a small evacuation for them from Laos, very small evacuation from Phnom Penh of, American military personnel. But the rest of the thousands and thousands of people escaped by feet, or by sea. And the tragic experiences that they had escaping, there's so much to go into, and we won't be able to do that now. But I think that at that period of time, many escaped to neighboring countries, and in terms of their experience, they would spend a varied length of time in refugee camps in neighboring countries, and then they could resettle in a host country, and the vast majority came to the United States, but others went to France and Australia and many other countries as well. And so for me, in terms of how I think about their experiences, or I should say my experience as well, is that a lot of the refugees were dispersed across the country. That's what we did in the 1970s and 80s. The United States didn't want any one community to be burdened with these refugees. So they just, wherever they could get sponsors, refugees went. But the communities that have been built that we see them today is because of the agency or that the people had themselves, that they didn't want to live in Providence. So they moved to Milwaukee to be with other family members and rebuilt their lives. So I think it's very interesting to really think about that Cold War context, because without the Cold War, the dynamics, the larger political, geopolitical, conditions, we would not have any Hmong people in the United States. So I would still be in the villages, tending to my chicken and my pigs.
Yeah. I mean, just a few things I would add to that is I think the overall displacement of Southeast Asians, from the 1970s onwards, far kind of exceeded the United States' capacity and willingness to resettle refugees. And I just recently read Jenna Littman's book, in Camps, which which conveys like some of the scale, that there's so much going on with regard to kind of refugee displacement and just the politics of refugee of settlement, that goes beyond the United States. But as Chia was saying, I think one of the really interesting differences between the politics towards refugees then and now is how much Cold War politics shaped what happened. And it's interesting, because I think on the one hand, the United States, like, was under pressure and wanted to show the world that it was a safe haven for people fleeing the communist world from, post-World War II onward. But when it came to, resettling Asian, refugees from, Southeast Asia, Korea, or what have you, Americans were still quite ambivalent. And, and so I think like there was this kind of ambivalence because of the legacy and history of anti-Asian, xenophobia from earlier. I think there was also just kind of hesitancy in general, like from the late 60s onward to like, kind of opening the gates to newcomers, like especially like poor newcomers, to what to great of an extent, like despite the politics of the Cold War. But, so the United States had, dealt with a lot of political ambivalence about like pressure on the one hand to kind of welcome people fleeing communist countries because of the Cold War. But then when it came to people from Asian countries, this, kind of racialized, kind of baggage and ambivalence that really, I think, really played out with regard to Southeast Asian refugees from the 70s onward.
Well, the 1960s and 70s also saw the growth of civil rights movements for marginalized groups across the US, including for Asian Americans, and college campuses seem to be especially fertile ground for that activism. What were the factors that sparked the Asian American civil rights movement?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the 60s and 70s, like there's a whole lot going on in Asian American history. So, kind of shifting now to histories of political activism and social movements. I would say, many of the same factors that made the 60s and 70s a really fertile period for social movements kind of fed the so-called Asian American movement. But first I should just, note that it's difficult, and I haven't quite figured out a way to do it, but like how to define the Asian American movement or Asian American civil rights movement, because some argue that it was at its core a, kind of middle class and reformist movement, while others emphasize that it was a fundamentally, leftist and revolutionary movement. So it was broad and diverse. It's hard to characterize, but if you think about what's going on in America and the world in the 60s and 70s, events like the civil rights movement, the ongoing struggle for Black freedom, the Vietnam War, movements against colonialism around the world. I mean, these were all very profound developments that impacted and awakened Asian Americans, along with many others. And so Asian Americans, right, many of whom were young activists at the time who were politicized in the 60s and 70s, spoke of being inspired by the courage of civil rights protesters, being inspired by the militancy and community dedication of groups like the Black Panther Party, or the ideas of Black writers and thinkers like W.B. Du Bois or Frantz Fanon. And so through kind of watching and learning about the struggles of others, especially African Americans and colonized people around the world, Asian Americans really start looking at their own lives in new, more critical ways. So this era that we call kind of the Asian American movement of the 60s and 70s, we see, young Asian, they're not all young, but, many young Asian Americans learning about their own histories of racial oppression in America. They start to understand and articulate how the model minority stereotype, actually oppresses and silences them. And they start to make connections between the racism in the war in Vietnam and the US's larger legacy of colonialism and oppression. So it's a very, fertile period for a political awakening and just an expanded understanding of what's going on in the world. So the goals and activism of the Asian American movement were, like I said, very wide-ranging, and much of it coalesced around shaping a new, broad Pan-Asian identity. So it was about going beyond identifying as a Chinese American, Japanese American, Filipino American, but kind of embracing this notion of being Asian American. So, so we see the creation of new organizations that could, help advance and increase the power of Asian Americans. They're focusing on things like community empowerment, historical kind of unburying and preserving histories, about, kind of critical education, including the movement for Asian American studies as part of the larger ethnic studies movement in higher ed. And, and here we see Asian Americans, again, like forging this new consciousness as Asian Americans, but also creating solidarities across racial lines through organizations. So this was a college-based organization at San Francisco State, and it spread to other campuses like UC Berkeley, this group called the Third World Liberation Front. But young Asian American activists also formed their own, pan-ethnic groups like the Asian American Political Alliance, which was also very active in the movement for ethnic studies. So again, like I think it's a hard movement to characterize, but like one thing that's quite undeniable about this period is that it was a time of really elevated political, ferment and activism among Asian Americans with a number of different objectives.
Shelley, I was just going to add that, what's been, having been teaching Asian American history for, over a decade now too, one of the things I find very problematic is that only in the space of an Asian American studies class that people learn that there was such a thing as the Asian American movement. In a larger, more broad, for lack of a better word, a more broad mainstream, 60s course, you don't hear very much. And so when you ask people to name, any Asian American activists, that people don't learn about it, right? And when Yuri Kochiyama's photo was on Google, I asked people, just randomly, and I know, but it's just so difficult for me to see how, this work, should be a part of, these other larger groups, or classes as well, and not just within the context of a Asian American history or Asian American studies class. I think we have more work to do in that space.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and I'm in my 16th year teaching Asian American history at Oberlin, and it's just as eye-opening to Asian American students as it is to non-Asian American students to learn about this. And, and I think like this period, I mean, probably for the reasons that you're saying, Chie, like studying the 60s and 70s and activism, I think often ends up being kind of the most important and impactful, kind of unit in the Asian American history class that I teach.
Yeah. So.
Well, as you said, we often do not hear about this history of activism in the community, right? So often we are portrayed as being passive or compliant. As we look at the 1980s and 90s, certainly there have been, great strides in the 60s and 70s, but the discrimination continues. So could you talk about some of the racist attacks and rhetoric that we see in the 1980s and 1990s?
Sure. Yeah, I think that was me. So I guess I was just going to preface this by saying that one of the things that's been so difficult about acknowledging and tackling racism since the 80s is that the legal structures of racism, right? The immigration laws that we talked about, the bars to naturalization, segregation practices, et cetera, have, been dismantled, but intolerance, bigotry, and discrimination persist. And in teaching about racism in the US since the 80s, the subjects have, continued to be, and in some ways increasingly been, right? Because again, like the focus is away from things like immigration laws, but the subjects have increasingly become about violence, about anti-Asian rhetoric, and just anti-Asian attitudes in day-to-day life. So over the 80s and 90s, we see a lot of kind of local anecdotal, because there wasn't great, like national record keeping on this, but, mounting evidence of, like so-called vigilante violence and day-to-day harassment of Asians. So just some examples, in 1989, there was actually a school shooting in Stockton, California, where the victims, 5 Southeast Asian children, were killed by a white supremacist. I think this was also in the 1980s, attacks in Jersey City by this group calling themselves the quote unquote dot busters, who randomly attacked South Asian immigrants. And then in 1982, the murder of Vincent Chin in Detroit was a very shocking and galvanizing event because of its, just kind of the violent brutality of the attack. So the killing was committed by 2 white men who were, kind of reeling against the backdrop of economic recession and loss of jobs in the auto industry. It was also very shocking and disconcerting because of, this kind of dynamic of scapegoating. He was a Chinese American, mistaken for Japanese. And then, finally, in the wake of his killing, the dehumanization of his life, in the fact that there was really just no justice, for him. So the main attacker was given court fees and parole and didn't serve a single day in prison. So again, like, despite the fact that, like, we seem to have at least dismantled the legal structures of racism, violence against racism, kind of just day-to-day racism against Asians has persisted and continued to take on these very unsettling and horrifying forms. Unfortunately, over the last few decades, with better data gathering and incident reporting, we're seeing that attacks and harassment of Asians have actually become more commonplace, especially against the backdrop of COVID. I was just reading some articles recently, and according to one survey, 1 in 10 Asians, again, this is during COVID, 1 in 10 Asians have been coughed on or spit on, and 1 in 3 have been told to go back to your country, right? So that kind of very common Asian racialized taunt. And large numbers of Americans continue to believe that Asian Americans are in part responsible for COVID, and do not believe, right? So on the one hand, they believe that Asian Americans have some responsibility for COVID, but they also don't believe that anti-Asian racism is on the rise. So, so we still have, these really, kind of huge challenges and problems in front of us. A big question is, what do we do about this, now in 2022? I think passing more effective hate crimes law is one area of work and activism that we've, been seeing. President Biden signed a new law last year, I think, bolstering, some resources for Asian victims and COVID related attacks. Another recent article in the Brookings Institution website by a sociologist named Jennifer Lee argued that, when crimes occur specifically with Asian targets, people tend to not notice because of the invisibility of Asians in the American imagination, which suggests that, like, this really kind of it needs to go beyond, just like kind of figuring out the right kinds of hate crimes laws to, craft and pass. So crimes against Asian Americans tend to not be noticed as much because of their general invisibility in the American imagination. So Lee notes that, for instance, they don't appear in kind of curricula in American history. Most Americans, like Chia was saying, can't name an important Asian American historical figure. Asian American, research doesn't get funded as much as research for other groups. And so I think coming up with kind of better and more hate crimes laws and finding ways to punish these kinds of crimes and violence is not going to, address all of those problems. But I think, rooting out these things through, I don't know, like kind of just gaining a better understanding of the psychology of racism and unconscious bias, and just, implementing greater inclusion of Asians in our analysis of Asians in American society has to be part of the work as well.
Chia, would you like to share your thoughts as well? This is certainly part of your work at the university.
Yeah, and people have been asking me, I recently became the vice chancellor for diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I, you know, people have asked me some strange questions, and it's not just other people, it's Asian colleagues too. They ask me, "Oh, Chia, you're one of our most productive scholars. Why are you doing diversity work?" And you know, we should be doing diversity, equity, inclusion work. All of us should be doing this work because I really believe, as we talked about, as Shelley talked about the 60s and 70s and before too, whenever things are better for Black people in this country, they tend to be better for everyone. That is really a core belief. And people like Yuri Kuchiyama, Grace Lee Boggs, the work that they've done, it's the Afro, Asian collaborations over time. Most people don't know about this. And with COVID, we often think about, or this has been said a lot about, oh, Asians, they don't speak back and they're quiet. That is not really true. As I think the panelists from the last panel talked about, despite the restrictions, despite the exclusions, Asians have fought, Asians have, taken, things to court cases and really fought against these, discriminatory practices. So I am so, I don't know, what really fuels me right now is that we have to care. We really have to care about everyone. We cannot only hurt when someone looks like us is hurting. And that's my new thing for myself is that, when a Latinx child or anyone is hurt, regardless of how they are socially defined, we need to care. And we can't just only come out when it's somebody from our community. And that's my challenge for myself and for others too in this moment is that it's that humanity, argument that, we can't just sit back because they don't look like us and it doesn't impact our community. I think the more we get out of those mentality and show up and continue the fight, the legacy that many before us have done so, but we didn't learn about them. So we think that there wasn't any Asian people fighting for all these different rights, but there were so many. And so I just wanted, I know that education has never prevented hate, right? And violence, but education helps us to think a little bit more deeply about our actions and the actions of others.
Chia, you had mentioned earlier, and I'm thinking about all of this against the backdrop of the label, quote, model minority, and we had talked about that earlier. So as we look at the 20th century, could you elaborate on that a bit more in terms of the persistence throughout, the 1980s, 1990s, and how that served as a wedge, as you were, talking about?
Yeah, so we learned about the beginning of Asian presence in this country in the ways in which Asians have been described as not American and that they are the other and they're dirty, filthy, all these, awful words that are used to describe that. But then they kind of transition, right? In 1966, there's these, U.S. News and World and Time articles talking about the model minority, and that is Asian Americans, specifically Chinese and Japanese, right? So the model minority really is that, this is really a group that they work hard, they don't complain, and they don't need anybody to help them. They just kind of pull themselves off. And all the discrimination they face, they still can thrive. And so why can't other minority, for lack of a better word, other racial groups, right? Why can't they just do the same thing? So that's been a double-edged sword for the Asian community or Asian American or AAPI community because we are so diverse. If you look at, again, the geographic band of Asia. We're from East Asia to West Asia, Central, South Asia. We're so diverse, but you come here and you are in one category. And if someone comes in 1965, right, as someone from a professional versus a refugee family, very different experience, but we are under one label. And for many of the communities like my community, so as an aggregate, Asians are highly educated. When you just look at the aggregate data, Asians have higher, education than whites, right? And or many Asians as a category, right, have a higher socioeconomic status than other groups. So as a group, we are doing really well. But when you unpack that, then there's so many people in our community that are struggling. But I think the danger of this model minority myth is that it does pit communities of color against each other. And there's a lot of resentment because of that. And I also think that, kind of reflecting on how it has impacted, Asian Americans too, is that lumping, right, ignoring the struggles of many groups. And then also for Asians ourselves, as someone who is Hmong, for a long time, others who, because my community was pulling down the Asian, progress, we were our communities were on welfare because we didn't have any education. And so we struggled for a long time. So people were ashamed. We were described as the ugly cousin of Asian Americans. That's really awful for people to say to each other. But it's because we were not living up to that model minority, not because we didn't want to, but it's the conditions in which we began our lives in this country. I also think that because of the model minority myth, all the race conversations, like as Shelley mentioned too, is that it's so binary. We're not even a part of those conversations about race. It's Black and white, it may be Hispanic, Latinx, but Asians are not part of those conversations intentionally. So then it's as if we're not impacted, but we are in so many different ways. I name a couple of very recent dangers of this model minority myth, right? And the grouping of all Asians. For example, college admission. The kinds of recent, lawsuits and recent policy changes that actually really discriminate against Asian students for changing, in the spirit of access and inclusion, then it actually discriminates against Asian students who may have tried very hard. And I also want to give just an example to end here in the danger of the category of Asian Americans and the category of model minority is that for groups like Southeast Asians, and in particular Hmong and the newer, Korean and Burmese refugees, and they're also Southeast Asian, but we're not counted, right? Asians are not counted as underrepresented minorities. So in so many spaces, we don't get access to support. So for example, there's a recent Hmong American PhD student at Madison who was nominated for this, HHMI award, and she didn't get it. They took it away because she wasn't URM, because she was Asian. So that's very dangerous for me.
Yeah.
We also have a question from our audience, and they would like to know if each of you could share your thoughts on the status of ethnic studies or the study of Asian American history in particular in middle and high school curricula. Does it vary a lot by state, or are we seeing any nationwide trends? And in some places, it feels like this type of history is being removed due to the politicization of topics like critical race theory. So this is for both of you.
Yeah. Well, so interestingly, we're both based in the Midwest, so I can kind of speak from, from my point of view in Ohio, but I think, that there are some threats and there are some encouraging developments, because we are seeing the proposal of these, kind of anti-critical race theory legislations, which I see as basically an attempt to, just get us to stop talking about race and kind of analyzing, race altogether, including, histories of Asian Americans. On the other hand, I'm seeing, and I've personally been contacted by people at, in local, school districts, and kind of statewide teacher organizations who want to put together, K through 12 curricula that includes Asian American history. And actually, like the state of Ohio is also considering a bill to require some instruction in Asian American history in all of the public high schools. So it's kind of interesting because you see these like moves to essentially ban the teaching of ethnic studies, but then also movements to kind of implement the teaching of ethnic studies. And so, so what I take away from that is, is just a strengthened kind of obligation and sense of responsibility to be part of the work to ensure that, some knowledge of Asian Americans within US history classes or other forms of curricula, just to be part of that work. And yeah, so it's actually a very weird moment with regard to ethnic studies. But these are classes and departments that people had to fight for, right? It's part of the history of the Asian American movement. And just because we have, departments and faculty in institutions of higher ed, and even these, developments to get them incorporated into K through 12, it doesn't mean that, kind of we're done with our work. I think it means that we all have to stay engaged, because it's still under threat if we don't stay vigilant and engaged.
I'll just quickly add that one of the biggest challenge and observation is that, we are one nation, right? But the way in which education is structured, it's all over, right? And so very recently, the AAPI coalition in Wisconsin received some funding to help develop some, content for K-12 education. That's, and then, we're in Wisconsin, there's all kinds of, other forces against teaching ethnic studies. So I think, Shelley, I agree with you. It's just going to be, we'll just have to continue to, I don't want to say the word fight, but I just acknowledge that all our histories matter. And the reasons why we do what we do every day is not just because we don't want to do other things, but it is so important to acknowledge, to have a place at the table. And I see so many dedicated, and not just Asian people of Asian descent, right? There's many people who teach ethnic studies, who teach Asian American histories, who are not Asian themselves. And many of us teach other topics and we're not of those identities. But I think it just takes many people to acknowledge and value that we all, that everyone needs to be represented in this, history of this nation, because many people contributed. And so we're just acknowledging the facts that took place. We're not changing anything. We're actually just broadening the perspectives and being inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have another question from the audience. It's in the last session, the speakers talked about some stereotypes perpetuated against Asian women, including over-sexualization. Did these stereotypes and others continue into the 20th century and today? Shelley, why don't you tackle that one first?
In short, yes. It continues to the present day, and you see it in in popular culture. I think it was evident in the Atlanta shootings last year, so I think in some of the kind of instances of Asian racialized violence towards women, but just kind of all around us. I think this kind of problem of kind of sexualized racism towards Asian women is it's just kind of fundamental to the problem of anti-Asian racism in the US.
No, I agree with that. And I also want to think more broadly, especially in the work that I'm doing now. I am perpetually challenging myself to kind of, think across, groups and the kinds of stereotypes, sexualization of Asian women. There's so much, stereotypes about all groups of women as well. And so I think I don't know. I think that the reality is that stereotypes, they're just stereotypes, right? But it's when, people take action, act upon those stereotypes, and, then it hurts people. There's violence. And the a couple years ago, there was a Hmong woman walking in the park, and she was assaulted and killed. And so simply because she was an Asian woman walking in the park. And what does that say, right? What kinds of stereotypes are going through those people's minds? And that's very dangerous. So I think, Kelly, Shelley, I worry every day, that the fact that it's so prevalent, right? And we like to think of the past too. We are historians, so we like to think about then, and things are better now. But the ways in which it manifests itself is, I think, even more dangerous now than in the past.
We have a final question. As is true of many of these types of labels, Asian American and AAPI are really umbrella terms that group together people with a wide variety of ethnic and cultural and historical backgrounds. In relation to the study of this history, what are the advantages and disadvantages of these terms? Do you think they are sufficient? Shelley?
Yeah, so like terms like AAPI in particular, I guess just, general point, terms are important, right? The terminology that we use, they're important, but they change and they're complicated. And so, just a little bit, I'm thinking about kind of the history of changing terms that we use to talk about Asian Americans. I mean, the term Asian American, right, was supposedly coined in the late 60s by some of these activists from that era, as a way to reject the kind of the derogatory terms like, kind of Oriental and others. It was a way to create this affirmative and empowering Pan-Asian identity, and also just to put forth a label that Asian Americans themselves came up with and embraced. The disadvantage of the term Asian American, that I think has emerged over time is that, or the shortcoming is that it potentially, and this is, I think, going to be a problem with any term, is that it potentially glosses over differences among Asians of different national backgrounds, histories, and identities. Asian American is, it's a political category. It's not a cultural category. So, how one creates ties of personal affinity as an Asian American, and what Asian Americans actually have in common with one another is an ongoing question. AAPI, so Asian American Pacific Islander, is an interesting term because it reflects an expansion of Asian Americans and it started being used by academics and some organizations, and even the government for population data purposes in the 1980s onwards. And the argument for AAPI was that it allowed for the inclusion of Pacific Islander groups like Native Hawaiians, Samoans, Guamanians, who tended to get left out of the usual racial categories and conversations about race in America. So on the other hand, AAPI has, like Asian American, created problems too, because the relationship of Pacific Islanders, right, like Native Hawaiians, Guamanians, and Samoans, their relationship to things like colonialism, migration, and US militarism are so different from, say, Japanese Americans and Chinese Americans. But the term AAPI, right, including like for this event and like, the fact that we have AAPI Heritage Month, the term has stuck. And, and even gets used in places like Ohio where I teach, but like it like hits really differently to like my students in the Midwest than it does in California, because they're just really mystified. Like, why do we say AAPI? Like, who are the Pacific Islanders that we talk about, and how are they a part of this history that we're learning? And so, so I think it's an interesting conversation. It's an important one about terminology. And so like something that I'm seeing recently, again, in Ohio, is like kind of experimentation with other permutations, like like Asian Pacific diaspora. So kind of using like diaspora to underscore the fact that, you know, there are kind of Asians who have dispersed, all Asian migrants who've dispersed all around the world. So it's not so, you know, US centric. That gives rise to its own problems as well, because, you know, you have so many different kind of historical and complex experiences there. But yeah, I mean, terminology, important, complex, always changing, and we should always be mindful about kind of why we're using the terms that we are, you know, while acknowledging some of the shortcomings.
I'll just quickly add that I think the advantage is that because it's tied to resources, right? These categories are tied to resources. So as a organizing, you know, factor, I think it can be useful because that's how we allocate resources to different, you know, groups. But at the same time, I think it's so political and regional, generational. New people who come to this country of Asian descent often tell me, I never saw myself as Asian until I have to check a box in the United States that I'm Asian, right? And then many groups, you know, we think of our ethnic identity first. And so, yes, I check the Asian because there's no other category for me to check. So I check Asian, but I don't know. I think live and breathe Hmong first, but then I know I'm part of a bigger, you know, racial category that is political, that can be beneficial, and numbers do count.
Mm-hmm. Right. There's kind of bureaucratic categories and identity categories, which, and there's a huge distance between them for Asian Americans in particular.
Yeah.
Well, Chia and Shelley, thank you so much again for sharing your expertise with us. We also want to thank all of you for joining us tonight. And of course, very special thanks to the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum for bringing us all together. We hope you'll join us again on July 7th as we move into the present. And on August 4th, the conversation will take a look at the future. Again, thank you so much for being with us this evening, and good night.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks.